In June 1944, after the success of D-Day, the United States Army expected momentum. On paper, nothing should have stopped them. The Allies had landed nearly 1 million men in Normandy within weeks. They controlled the skies. Their artillery could fire almost without limitation. Their supply lines stretched across the English Channel, feeding what was the most powerful military force ever assembled. And yet, within days of pushing inland, that momentum slowed, then stalled, then nearly collapsed. The numbers told a story commanders struggled to accept. In some sectors, American forces advanced no more than 400 yards per day. That's less than the length of 4 football fields. Progress that slow wasn't just frustrating, it was dangerous. Every day spent crawling forward gave the German army more time to reinforce, regroup, and counterattack. And the cost was staggering. In just 6 weeks of fighting, U.S. forces suffered around 40,000 casualties trying to move less than 20 miles inland. This wasn't supposed to happen, not here. But Normandy was not open terrain. It was something far worse, something few Allied planners had truly understood before landing. The countryside was divided into small fields, each surrounded by thick hedgerows known as bocage. These weren't simple bushes or fences. At their base were dense mounds of dirt, often several feet high, hardened into natural walls. On top grew tangled roots and trees so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. From the ground, you couldn't see through them. From a tank, you couldn't climb over them without exposing your underside. From the air, they looked harmless. On the battlefield, they were a nightmare. Each field became a miniature fortress. Every hedgerow was a defensive line, and behind those lines, German soldiers waited, hidden and prepared. The German army understood exactly what they had. Small units spread out, turning each field into a kill zone. Machine guns covered narrow openings. Mortars were pre-registered on approach routes. Anti-tank weapons were concealed behind hedgerows, invisible until they fired. It wasn't just defense, it was a system designed to bleed an attacking force. American troops quickly learned how deadly this system was. Advancing into a new field meant crossing open ground with no cover. The moment they moved, they were exposed. German fire would erupt from hidden positions, often at close range. Even if one hedgerow was cleared, the next waited just ahead, with another unseen enemy behind it. Tanks meant to lead the advance became liabilities. To cross a hedgerow, a tank had to climb it, lifting its front and exposing its thin underbelly, exactly where German gunners aimed. Many tanks were destroyed before they made it over. Others became stuck, easy targets. Infantry suffered just as much. Without visibility, coordination broke down. Units became separated. Communication faltered. Soldiers often fought blind, unsure where the enemy was until it was too late. What should have been coordinated assaults turned into fragmented, desperate engagements. Even overwhelming firepower couldn't solve the problem. Artillery was powerful, but imprecise in such close terrain. Air support struggled to identify targets hidden beneath dense foliage. Bombing runs risked hitting friendly forces. The advantages that defined Allied strength became less effective with every yard. For General Omar Bradley, the situation was becoming serious. He had expected resistance, but not this level of efficiency from a terrain that seemed so simple. Reports from the front showed high casualties, minimal gains, and no clear solution. Privately, Bradley began to fear something few wanted to say out loud. This could turn into another World War I, a grinding stalemate where progress was measured in yards and paid for in blood. Every standard solution was attempted: more artillery, more airstrikes, more coordinated assaults, but the results didn't change. The hedgerows absorbed it all. The German defenses adapted faster than the Americans could overcome them. What made the situation even more frustrating was how simple the obstacle seemed. There were no massive bunkers, no towering walls, just dirt, roots, and time. And yet, this ancient landscape was doing something modern warfare hadn't anticipated. It was neutralizing the power of a mechanized army. The deeper American forces pushed into Normandy, the clearer it became.
This wasn't just difficult terrain, it was a defensive system, one that had turned the battlefield itself into a weapon. And unless something changed, that weapon was going to keep killing. By July 1944, what the Allies faced in Normandy was no longer just resistance, it was a system. Not a line on a map, not a fortress, but a method of war that turned every field, every hedgerow, into part of a larger defensive machine. To understand why a million-man army was being slowed to a crawl, you have to understand how the German army chose to fight. This was not the rigid, static defense many expected. Instead, the Germans applied a doctrine often described as elastic defense, a flexible approach designed to absorb an attack, stretch it, and then break it apart. Rather than concentrating forces in obvious strong points, German units dispersed. Small groups of infantry, machine gunners, and anti-tank teams spread across the bocage landscape. Their job was not to hold ground in the traditional sense. Their job was to delay, disrupt, and inflict maximum casualties before slipping away or repositioning. The terrain made this approach devastatingly effective. The bocage divided the land into a maze of enclosed spaces. A unit positioned behind one hedgerow could not easily be seen from the next field. This meant German defenders could remain hidden until the last possible moment, waiting until American troops were close and vulnerable. Machine guns were placed to dominate the few natural gaps between hedgerows. These narrow openings became choke points, areas where advancing troops had no choice but to pass through predictable routes. Mortar teams operating from concealed positions pre-calculated these zones. The moment movement was detected, shells would begin to fall with alarming accuracy. Anti-tank weapons were perhaps the most dangerous element. Hidden behind thick earthen banks and foliage, German gunners could wait in complete concealment. American tanks, unable to see through the hedgerows, often advanced blindly. When they attempted to cross, they exposed their weakest armor. At that exact moment, a single well-placed shot could destroy a vehicle and block the path. What made this system even more effective was its depth. This was not a single defensive line, it was a series of layers. Even if American forces managed to clear one field, they immediately faced another hedgerow, another hidden position, another ambush waiting just ahead. Progress became a cycle of assault, loss, and regrouping. Communication among German units didn't need to be perfect. The terrain itself provided structure. Each small unit knew its sector, its firing lanes, its fallback routes. If one position was overrun, others nearby could continue the fight, creating overlapping zones of resistance. Among the formations defending this region was the Panzer Lehr Division. Unlike many other units, Panzer Lehr was composed of experienced soldiers and instructors, men who had spent years training others in armored warfare. But in Normandy, even they adapted. Their tanks were used sparingly, often held back from reckless engagement. Instead, they relied on terrain and supporting infantry. When they did strike, it was usually at moments of opportunity, counterattacks against overextended units, or sudden armored thrusts into undisorganized areas. This combination of discipline, experience, and terrain turned Panzer Lehr into a formidable opponent. In several engagements, they were able to halt or push back advancing forces that outnumbered them. It wasn't because they had more firepower, it was because they were fighting on terms that favored them. For American commanders, the situation was increasingly frustrating. Traditional tactics, mass, speed, firepower, were being neutralized. Attacks that should have broken through instead stalled after just a few hundred yards. Units that advanced too quickly risked isolation. Units that moved too slowly gave the enemy time to prepare. Even coordination between infantry and armor became difficult. Tanks couldn't see the enemy, infantry couldn't always keep up, and when either moved alone, they became vulnerable. The battlefield had been broken down into hundreds of small fights. Each hedgerow was its own problem. Each field had to be taken individually. There was no decisive maneuver that could collapse the system at once. And that was exactly the point. The German defense in Normandy wasn't designed to win quickly. It was designed to make the enemy pay for every inch, to slow them down, and to create a prolonged struggle. In many ways, it was the perfect counter to an army built on speed and overwhelming force. What made it so dangerous wasn't just its effectiveness, it was how ordinary it looked. There were no massive fortifications to destroy, no obvious targets for bombers, just fields, hedgerows, and an enemy that seemed to disappear and reappear at will. To the soldiers on the ground, it felt like fighting the landscape itself. And as long as that system remained intact, no amount of superiority was enough to overcome it. By mid-July 1944, American forces had learned the Normandy hedgerows were more than just obstacles. They were lethal traps. Commanders tried every standard solution, but each attempt revealed a fatal flaw in planning. The first approach relied on sheer firepower. Tanks and artillery were sent forward in concentrated strikes intended to blast paths through the enemy defenses. In practice, this was disastrous. Tanks exposed themselves while climbing hedgerows, leaving their vulnerable undersides open to concealed anti-tank teams. Artillery, although powerful, often overshot or fell short in the close enclosed terrain, sometimes hitting friendly troops instead of the enemy. Infantry assaults fared no better. Soldiers advancing behind tanks were frequently cut down by hidden machine guns or mortars. Communication broke down in the tangled fields, leaving units isolated. Even well-trained troops were forced to fight in small, fragmented groups, making coordinated attacks nearly impossible. Casualties mounted, and morale began to suffer. Men grew wary of advancing, knowing that every step forward could be their last. Officers struggled to maintain cohesion, while replacements, often inexperienced, were quickly overwhelmed by the relentless fighting. Engineers tried modifying vehicles to overcome the obstacles. Some tanks were fitted with crude attachments meant to tear through hedgerows. Others were reinforced with extra armor. Yet each innovation came with its own set of problems. Tanks became slower and less maneuverable, often getting stuck or overbalanced. Soldiers struggled to adapt to these experimental machines in combat, where timing and precision were everything. Each failed attempt eroded confidence and heightened the sense that the terrain itself was working against them. Air support, once a decisive advantage, also proved limited. Pilots found it nearly impossible to distinguish between enemy and friendly positions from the air. Dense foliage concealed German positions, turning bombing runs into a gamble. Precision attacks were rare, and when errors occurred, they could be deadly for the advancing infantry below. The stress on troops grew as they realized that even superior technology could not easily compensate for the complexity of the hedgerows. All four engineered solutions, massed firepower, infantry-led assaults, tank modifications, and airstrikes, failed repeatedly. The more the Americans tried, the more the Germans adapted. Each failure revealed the depth and resilience of the Bocage defense. Even elite German units like the Panzer Lehr Division exploited these weaknesses to devastating effect, reinforcing positions or striking at overextended American units with surgical precision. Despite these setbacks, American soldiers continued to push forward. Each attack, each attempt to innovate produced invaluable lessons. Commanders noted what worked and what didn't, gradually piecing together a clearer picture of the challenges they faced. They realized that conventional tactics, no matter how well resourced, would not be enough. Success would require ingenuity, improvisation, and a willingness to try something entirely unexpected. The pressure of constant failure, combined with battlefield urgency, set the stage for a single idea to emerge, an idea that would cut through the hedgerows, restore momentum, and reshape the entire campaign. By late July 1944, the stalemate in Normandy had pushed American forces to the brink of desperation. Casualties were mounting, morale was fraying, and commanders were running out of conventional options. Every strategy, every armored advance, every artillery strike had failed to break through the dense hedgerow defenses. It was clear that brute force alone would not win the day. And yet, amid this frustration, one unconventional idea was about to change the course of the battle. An idea that came not from generals or engineers, but from a single soldier on the front lines. Curtis G. Culin, a 29-year-old window trimmer from New Jersey, had been watching the struggle with keen eyes. As he moved through the fields, he noticed something others had overlooked: discarded scrap metal from German defenses scattered along the beaches and fields. While others saw useless debris, Culin saw potential. He began sketching ideas for a simple yet effective device, an attachment that could be mounted on a tank to cut through the thick hedgerows, turning what had been an impenetrable barrier into a passable path. At first, the idea was met with skepticism. Officers dismissed it as a gimmick, an impractical notion from an enlisted man. Yet Culin persisted, experimenting with different designs in secret, using whatever materials were at hand. Working with a small team, he welded scrap steel into a crude blade and tested it against the earthworks that had been stopping tanks in their tracks. Slowly, what had started as a casual observation became a working prototype capable of slicing through the hedgerows with surprising efficiency. Word of the device eventually reached higher command. General Omar Bradley himself witnessed a demonstration, initially skeptical but intrigued by the speed and effectiveness of the innovation. The question he asked would later become legendary: how many can you make, and how fast? The answer would determine whether this small invention could be deployed on a scale large enough to influence the battle. As production ramped up, the tanks equipped with these hedgerow cutters, later nicknamed rhinos, began to transform the battlefield. What had once required hours of risky maneuvering could now be accomplished in minutes. The cutters allowed tanks to punch directly through German defensive lines rather than being forced to climb over or circumvent each obstacle. Infantry could follow with greater safety, and coordinated assaults became more feasible. This moment of improvisation highlighted a critical lesson in warfare. Innovation does not always come from formal channels. Sometimes the solution to a seemingly insurmountable problem comes from observing the environment, thinking creatively, and having the courage to act on an unconventional idea. In the bocage of Normandy, Curtis Cullin's invention would soon turn a grueling, bloody stalemate into a breakthrough that changed the course of the campaign. The arrival of the rhinos on the front lines was more than a technological improvement. It was a psychological blow to the German defenders. For the first time, the impenetrable hedgerows no longer offered guaranteed protection. What had been the Americans' greatest vulnerability was being turned into a strength. A single observation, combined with ingenuity and determination, had begun to reshape the battlefield. The stage was now set for a rapid, decisive advance that would collapse the German defenses in Normandy once and for all.
By the end of July 1944, the American forces were ready to test the innovation that had emerged from the front lines. The hedgerow cutters, crude yet effective, were mounted on tanks and prepared for a large-scale offensive. What had once been an insurmountable obstacle, the dense, tangled bocage of Normandy, was about to be challenged in a way that German commanders had never anticipated. The Americans had spent weeks learning the terrain, enduring heavy losses, and understanding the limits of conventional tactics. Now they were ready to turn those lessons into decisive action. The operation, later known as Operation Cobra, began with careful planning. Tanks equipped with the cutters spearheaded the assault, slicing directly through the earthen walls that had stopped entire divisions. Infantry followed closely, taking advantage of the new mobility and the ability to maintain cohesion while advancing.
For the first time in weeks, American units could move as a combined force rather than being fragmented by the hedgerows. The pace of advance accelerated dramatically, and German defenders were caught off guard. Confidence surged among American troops, who now realized that the obstacle that had cost so many lives could be overcome. The elite Panzer Lehr Division, which had been considered nearly invincible in the hedgerows, faced an unprecedented challenge. Tanks that once struggled to climb over obstacles now surged through them, and previously protected firing positions were suddenly exposed. The German troops, trained to exploit the terrain, found that the very defensive system they had relied upon no longer offered security. Confusion spread, lines collapsed, and counterattacks that might have been effective before were neutralized by the sheer speed of the breakthrough. Entire positions that had held for weeks fell within hours, demonstrating the devastating efficiency of the new tactic. Over the next 11 days, the impact of the hedgerow cutters became clear. American forces advanced farther and faster than they had managed in the previous 6 weeks of brutal fighting. German positions that had been fortified and defended with precision were overrun or bypassed. The combination of innovation, coordination, and courage allowed the Allies to achieve in days what had previously seemed impossible: a collapse of the German defensive system that had dominated Normandy. The transformation was so complete that what had been considered one of Germany's most effective defensive strategies became irrelevant almost overnight. The consequences were profound. Operation Cobra opened a path for the Americans to move rapidly through France, liberating towns and villages that had been contested for weeks. German forces were forced into retreat, abandoning positions that had seemed impregnable. Casualty rates, while still high, began to stabilize as the momentum shifted decisively. The bocage, once the Allies' greatest obstacle, had been conquered not by superior numbers or firepower alone, but by ingenuity applied under extreme conditions. The psychological impact on both sides was immense, as the Americans gained confidence and the Germans were left scrambling to adapt to a battlefield that had suddenly changed beyond recognition. This episode also highlighted the importance of individual initiative in warfare. A single observation by a soldier, combined with determination and creative problem-solving, had turned the tide. Curtis G. Cullin's invention demonstrated that even the most entrenched defenses could be overcome with thinking that challenged conventional assumptions. By the close of this 11-day breakthrough, Normandy was no longer a battlefield dominated by impassable hedgerows. The Americans had taken the fight to the enemy on new terms, showing that adaptability and innovation could transform the most difficult circumstances into opportunity. The success of Operation Cobra became a defining moment in the campaign, proving that even the most formidable defenses could be rendered irrelevant when ingenuity met courage on the battlefield, forever changing how modern mechanized armies approached entrenched positions.